What happens when the very conquests that make a republic powerful begin to hollow it out from within? When the soldiers who defend the state return home to find they no longer have homes to return to? Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
There's a moment when reform becomes impossible through peaceful means, and violence enters political life as a permanent feature rather than an aberration. Tonight, we turn to a Roman tribune who tried to solve a structural crisis through law, and whose efforts instead inaugurated a century of bloodshed. We ask how land inequality can destabilize even the most powerful state, and what it means when institutional channels close and violence becomes the only available language.
Rome in the 2nd century, before the Common Era had conquered the Mediterranean world. But that very expansion created a crisis at home. The small farmers who formed the backbone of the Roman army were being displaced by wealthy elites who had absorbed their land, and the constitutional structure built for a city-state was proving incapable of managing an empire.
We are speaking about Tiberius Gracchus.
Tiberius Gracchus was a Roman tribune in 133, before the Common Era, who proposed sweeping agrarian reforms to redistribute public land to landless citizens, and whose assassination by a senatorial mob marks the first use of organized political violence in Republican Rome, establishing a precedent that would accelerate the Republic's collapse.
Then let us begin with the structural crisis that made Tiberius necessary.
To understand what Tiberius confronted, we must first understand what Roman expansion had done to Roman society. Rome's victories over Carthage, Macedon, and the Greek kingdoms had made it the dominant power in the Mediterranean by the mid-2nd century. These conquests brought enormous wealth into Rome: gold, silver, slaves, and tribute. But the wealth was not distributed evenly. It flowed primarily to the aristocratic families who commanded armies, administered provinces, and collected taxes. The same wars that enriched the elite devastated the small farmers who formed the Roman army. Military service required extended campaigns far from Italy. Men spent years away from their farms, unable to plant or harvest, relying on family members who often could not maintain the land alone.
So the soldiers defending Rome were simultaneously losing the economic foundation of their lives.
Exactly. And when they returned, many found their farms had been sold for debt or absorbed by wealthier neighbors. The mechanism for this consolidation was the ager publicus, public land that Rome had confiscated from defeated Italian peoples. Technically, this land belonged to the Roman state. In practice, wealthy families had occupied vast tracts of it, treating it as private property, and working it with the slave labor that flooded into Italy after each new conquest. The rise of slave estates, what the Romans called latifundia, transformed Italian agriculture. Small farms producing grain were replaced by large estates producing wine and olive oil for export, worked by enslaved laborers rather than citizen farmers.
So conquest created the economic conditions that undermined the very class of citizens who made conquest possible.
Yes, and this created a military crisis alongside the social one. The Roman army was not a professional force, it was a citizen militia. Only property owners above a certain census qualification could serve in the legions. As small farmers lost their land, the pool of citizens eligible for military service shrank. Rome was conquering more territory but had fewer citizens capable of defending it. The contradiction was becoming. Into this crisis stepped Tiberius Gracchus. He was born around 163 before the Common Era into one of the most distinguished families in Rome. His father had been consul twice and censor. His mother was Cornelia, daughter of Scipio Africanus, the general who had defeated Hannibal.
So Tiberius was not an outsider agitating against the elite. He was the elite.
Exactly. His reformist position was not born of personal hardship, but of observation and analysis. He served as a military tribune in Spain and North Africa, where he witnessed the conditions that produced the crisis directly. According to the historian Plutarch, Tiberius traveled through Etruria on his way to or from Spain and was struck by the landscape. Vast estates worked by foreign slaves with almost no free Italian farmers visible. The emptiness of the countryside confirmed what the census figures already showed. In 133, Tiberius was elected tribune of the plebs, one of 10 annually elected officials whose role was to protect the interests of common citizens against patrician domination. The tribunate came with a sacred person, meaning tribunes could not be physically harmed, and the power of veto which allowed them to block almost any action by other magistrates.
So the office gave him both protection and leverage.
Yes, Tiberius proposed an agrarian law, the Lex Sempronia Agraria, which aimed to enforce an old limit on the amount of public land any individual could occupy. The limit was 500 jugera, roughly 320 acres, with an additional 250 jugera allowed for each son. Land held beyond these limits would be reclaimed by the state and redistributed to landless citizens in small plots. A commission of 3 men would be appointed to survey the land, identify violations, and oversee the redistribution. The proposal was not radical in principle. It invoked existing law rather than creating new rights. The limits on public land occupation had been established generations earlier, but had never been enforced. Tiberius was simply proposing to apply the law as written.
So the law was conservative in form but revolutionary in its implications.
Exactly, because by the 130s, the senatorial aristocracy had come to regard their occupation of public land as effectively permanent. They had held it for generations, built estates on it, derived their wealth from it. Many had made improvements, planted orchards, constructed buildings, all on land they technically did not own. Tiberius brought the law directly to the plebeian assembly, the citizen body that elected tribunes and passed laws on matters concerning the plebs. He bypassed the Senate, which had no formal legislative power but exercised enormous influence through custom and prestige. The Senate opposed the law fiercely. They pressured another tribune, Marcus Octavius, to veto it. Octavius was a colleague of Tiberius, and possibly a friend, but he represented wealthy landholders, and used his tribunician veto to block the legislation.
So a constitutional system was designed to allow one tribune to neutralize another.
Yes, the veto was meant to prevent hasty or oppressive legislation, but Tiberius argued that Octavius was misusing the office. A tribune was supposed to defend the interests of the people. By blocking a law that would help landless citizens, Octavius was betraying his constitutional duty. Tiberius took an unprecedented step. He brought a motion to the assembly to depose Octavius from office. This had never been done before. Tribunes served fixed 1-year terms. The people had elected Octavius. Removing him mid-term violated the understood rules of republican politics. But here is where it shifts.
So, Tiberius had circumvented the institutional check by appealing directly to popular sovereignty.
Exactly, and in doing so he had shattered a fundamental norm of republican governance. The Senate was outraged not only at the agrarian law but at the constitutional precedent. If tribunes could be removed by popular vote whenever the Senate disapproved of their actions, the Senate's ability to constrain popular legislation was finished. The Agrarian Commission was established. Tiberius, his brother Gaius, and their father-in-law Appius Claudius were appointed as commissioners. They began surveying land and planning redistribution. But the Senate moved to obstruct the commission at every turn. The Senate allocated almost no funding for the commission's work. When the king of Pergamum passed away and bequeathed his kingdom and treasury to Rome, Tiberius proposed using that money to fund the land redistribution. Again he bypassed the Senate, taking the proposal directly to the assembly. Again it passed.
So each success deepened the constitutional conflict.
Yes, Tiberius's opponents accused him of seeking kingship, of building a personal following among the landless poor that he could use to overturn the republic. These accusations had historical weight in Rome, where the monarchy had been overthrown 5 centuries earlier, and the word king remained the ultimate political insult. As his 1-year term neared its end, Tiberius faced a problem. If he left office, he would lose his tribunician immunity. His enemies could prosecute him for unconstitutional conduct, particularly the deposition of Octavius. He decided to seek re-election for a consecutive second term, something else that had never been done. The election was held in the summer of 133. The assembly met on the Capitoline Hill. Tensions were extreme. Rumors circulated that Tiberius planned to declare himself king. Senators claimed that his supporters were arriving armed.
So the political conflict was becoming a physical confrontation.
Exactly, and this is the turning point. They armed themselves and their followers with clubs and pieces of broken furniture. They marched to the assembly. What followed was a massacre. Tiberius and approximately 300 of his supporters were beaten to death. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber River, rather than given proper burial. It was the first act of organized political violence in the history of the Roman Republic. For 4 centuries, Roman political competition had been fierce, but contained within legal and customary boundaries. Exile was the harshest punishment for political opponents. Now, senators had used violence to settle a constitutional dispute. The threshold had been crossed.
So 133 marked the moment when violence became a legitimate political tool.
Yes, the Agrarian Commission continued its work for a time under Tiberius's brother Gaius and others. Some land was redistributed, but the political damage was irreversible. The assassination established a precedent. When institutional channels failed, force could be used. 10 years later, Tiberius Gracchus would become tribune and attempt even more ambitious reforms. He too would be met with senatorial violence. He and thousands of his supporters would be killed in street fighting in 121. The pattern was repeating and intensifying. The underlying structural problems that Tiberius had tried to address were never fully solved. Land inequality continued. The citizen base continued to shrink. The military crisis worsened until Marius reformed the army by recruiting landless citizens, creating professional legions loyal to their generals rather than to the state.
So the failure to solve the land crisis eventually produced the conditions for military dictatorship.
Exactly. The next century would see civil wars between Marius and Sulla, between Caesar and Pompey, between Octavian and Antony. Each conflict traced its origins in part to the structural crisis of the late 2nd century, and the failure of republican institutions to address it peacefully. Historians debate whether Tiberius was naive about the depth of senatorial opposition, or whether he understood the risk and accepted it. His methods were constitutionally creative, but also destabilizing. He used popular sovereignty to override institutional checks, a move that his opponents saw as tyrannical.
So the question is whether his constitutional innovations were necessary reforms or dangerous precedents.
Yes, and the answer may be that they were both. The Senate had demonstrated it would not allow meaningful reform through normal channels. Tiberius forced the issue by bypassing those channels. But in doing so, he contributed to the normalization of constitutional violation that would accelerate the Republic's collapse. The tragedy of Tiberius Gracchus is that he was right about the problem and right about its urgency, but the solution he attempted could not be contained within the existing system. The Republic was built for small-scale politics among a relatively homogeneous elite, could not manage an empire or mediate fundamental class conflicts.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret. Margaret, for those who want to understand how the Gracchus crisis fits into the longer collapse of the Republic, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with The Roman Revolution by Ronald Syme.
This is a book about the structural forces that eroded Republican governance.
Precisely. Syme offers a structural analysis of the erosion of the Roman Republic, examining how weak competition, land inequality, political violence, and institutional manipulation gradually destabilized Republican governance. Though centered on the later transition to imperial rule, the book helps situate the Gracchus reforms within the longer arc of Republican fragmentation.
Is it accessible to someone coming to Roman history for the first time?
It is dense and assumes familiarity with Roman political institutions, so a first-time reader may need to proceed slowly and keep reference materials nearby. But Syme's analytical framework is unmatched for understanding the systemic nature of the collapse. The book makes clear that the fall of the Republic was not the work of a few ambitious individuals, but the result of structural contradictions that accumulated over generations.
So reading it gives you the long view of how republics disintegrate.
Exactly. For anyone who wants to understand Tiberius as part of a larger pattern rather than as an isolated reformer, Syme provides the essential framework.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Tiberius Gracchus operates on multiple levels that must be examined separately. The first level is immediate and tragic. The use of violence to resolve a political dispute established a precedent that could not be reversed. Once senators had demonstrated they would kill to defend their interests, the boundary between politics and war had dissolved. Every subsequent political crisis in the late Republic would be resolved in part through force. The proscriptions under Sulla, the conspiracy of Catiline, the civil wars of the 1st century, all traced their legitimacy back to 133.
So Tiberius's assassination became the permission structure for a century of bloodshed.
Exactly. The second level is constitutional. Tiberius demonstrated that popular assemblies could be mobilized to bypass senatorial authority. This was both a strength and a danger of the republican system. Later, popularis politicians who positioned themselves as champions of the people against the Senate would follow Tiberius's playbook, use tribunician power, appeal directly to the assemblies, circumvent traditional channels. Julius Caesar was operating in this tradition when he crossed the Rubicon. The third level is the unresolved substantive crisis. The land problem that Tiberius identified did not disappear. The Agrarian Commission redistributed some land, but nowhere near enough to restore the small farmer class or the citizen soldier base.
So the structural problem persisted even as the political violence it generated intensified.
Yes, the fourth level is the intellectual and moral legacy. Later writers would argue about whether Tiberius had been a hero or a demagogue. Cicero, writing decades later, condemned the Gracchi as destroyers of constitutional order. Others saw them as martyrs who had died defending the people's rights. This debate has continued for 2 millennia. Modern historians who emphasize structural forces tend to see Tiberius as attempting to address a real crisis within a broken system. Those who emphasize individual agency tend to see him as accelerating the Republic's collapse through his methods, even if his goals were laudable. The question Tiberius's life poses for modern politics is whether systemic reform is possible within constitutional boundaries, when those who control the system benefit from the status quo. If normal channels are blocked, what is legitimate?
So his legacy is a question about the limits of institutional change.
Exactly, and that question remains urgent. Contemporary democracies facing wealth inequality, institutional gridlock, and erosion of norms can see in Tiberius's story a warning about what happens when systems cannot adapt to changing conditions. The Roman Republic took a century to collapse after Tiberius's passing. The process was not inevitable at any single moment. But each failure to address fundamental problems made the next crisis more likely, and each resort to violence made the next resort easier. The specific mechanism of collapse was land inequality, creating a military crisis that produced professional armies loyal to generals rather than the state. But the deeper pattern was institutional rigidity in the face of structural change.
So the lesson is not about land policy specifically, but about how political systems respond to inequality.
Yes. Tiberius's story is studied in political science and history courses not because agrarian reform is universally relevant, but because the dynamics he confronted are entrenched elites resisting redistribution, institutional mechanisms failing, popular pressure building, reformers forced into increasingly radical tactics, violence becoming normalized. The Roman Republic was not destroyed by external enemies, it was not defeated in battle, it destroyed itself through its inability to resolve internal contradictions peacefully. Tiberius Gracchus was the first major casualty of that failure, but he would not be the last.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the crisis of land, power, and institutional failure that marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic.
Tiberius Gracchus tried to save the Republic through reform and died for it, and his assassination taught Rome that violence works, a lesson it would spend the next century applying until the Republic itself was.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.